For my final instruction project, I chose to write a manual on designing a knitted sweater. I just want to make note that if you're going to design a knitted sweater, it's a good idea to have basic understanding of the principles of knitting, understanding how to do an increase, decrease, maybe know a little bit about how to knit cables, how to cast on, cast off, and just how to understand the basic shapes of knitting sweaters. This is an example of a sweater that I knitted as a gift. As you can see, it has striping, and there's an example of color work where I changed color to make a pattern in the front of the sweater. Also, I cut the yarn or the fabric here and put in a zipper. I did that with my sewing machine. And then I used increases and decreases in order to shape the sleeves and make them so they fit a normal person's shoulders. So this is an example of how you would sketch out a basic sweater pattern. You want to take measurements from these particular places on your body as well. So you can translate the measurements you take from yourself into your sweater pattern, so you have a sweater that actually is going to fit you. So I always start with measuring around my shoulders, so I know how big to make my armhole for the sweater, and that would be this top measurement here. Also, you want to know how long to make your sleeve, so you'd measure from your shoulder to your wrist or wherever you want your sleeve to end. And also you want to know the sleeve's cuff circumference by measuring around your wrist or wherever you want the sleeve to end. It's also important to measure your back length and half bust circumference, or I usually just do a full chest measurement all the way around. You got to know how wide your neck is, and again, armhole depth here. And it's a good idea to measure from where you want your collar to sit to the bottom of your sweater. The better you are at knitting and designing patterns, the easier it's going to get to do shaping. So you can knit a basic sweater that has a square shape, or you can insert increases and decreases here to give your sweater more shape to fit you better. So here you'd want to measure your waist and your hips and your bust and do a series of decreases and increases here in order to get that shaping. And I'll talk about how to calculate those increases and decreases later on in the presentation. So it's really important to understand how different fibers are going to influence your knitted project. For example, this is wool right here. It's going to be really warm, and different types of wool are going to feel different. Merino wool is softer than normal wool. This right here is hand-spun Kiviot, which is probably the warmest fiber on earth, and it's made from muskox down hair. It's going to be a lot warmer than wool, but it's also more expensive, and it's usually spun in thinner yarn, thinner strands, so you're not going to knit a sweater out of Kiviot unless you have a lot of money. This here is an example of Angora, and this is really what we call a halo effect with the yarn. The hairs kind of naturally come out of the yarn a little bit, and it makes it like this fuzzy feel to it. It's important to remember how these different fibers are going to change the overall look of your sweater. There's tons of other fibers to choose from, so it's really important to know what you're knitting with, because some fiber is going to shrink, some isn't, some's going to be warmer than others, and certain blends of yarn are going to act different. So it's important to choose what fiber you want when you're designing a knitted sweater, as well as what color. So the most important thing about designing a sweater is understanding how gauge works. So here we have knitted stitches. We have these V-shaped stitches here, and that is from knitting basic stockinette stitch. And how you measure gauge is you count how many stitches that you have in a 4" by 4" knitted swatch. So you're going to have 1 here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and however many inches you have here. It's important to know how many stitches you have per 4 inches and per inch. And it's also important not to round up. So let's say that you have 1.5 stitches per inch. Don't round that to 2 because that will drastically change the finished measurement of your garment. You also want to know how many stitches you have, how many rows you have vertically. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You might have more rows per 4 inches than you would stitches. So it's important to know the vertical and horizontal differences. When you're designing a sweater, you want to know where to place your cables, what kind of cables you might want, and cables influence the gauge. So you can fit more stitches per 4 inches with cables than you could just normal stockinette stitch. So that's important to know. Also, if you want to do any lacework detail, you have to know that as well, how that's going to influence your gauge. So when you're designing your own sweater, it's really important to know how your increases and decreases are going to work. Because, for example, here I've drawn a sleeve. You have the top of the sleeve where it meets your shoulder piece of your sweater. You have your sleeve cuff, and you want your sleeve to get bigger, obviously, because your arm's going to get bigger as you go up. So here, let's say you have 10 inches of sleeve length, and you have to go from 20 stitches here to, let's say 25 stitches here. So you're increasing 5 stitches here, and you have 10 inches to go. So that means every 10 inches, or you're going to divide 10 inches by 5 to figure out how many inches increments that you're going to want to increase. So for this example, you'd want to increase 2 stitches, 1 each side every, let's say 5 inches or so, or excuse me, every 2 inches or so. And you always want to do increases equally on each side. That'll just make your sleeve uniform and symmetrical down the middle. So this is just a basic example of how you calculate increases to get a wider width at the top of your sleeve than you would starting here. If you wanted to do waist shaping for your sweater, you want a form-fitting sweater, you would decrease and increase accordingly to figure out how you can make that knitted fabric shaped better to your form. And I talk a lot more about that in my instruction manual. And there's tons of resources out there as well on how to calculate your gauge and how to translate it into this idea of the perfect knitted sweater for yourself. Here are a couple references for the photos that I posted in this video. And I wish you happy knitting, and thank you for watching my instruction manual.